All right, so we're going to talk about matter this chapter. So first of all, let's define matter. So matter is anything that has mass and takes up space. Has mass and takes up space. Another word for takes up space is it has mass and volume. And so as we think of matter, matter can be classified into two different things. One, it can either be a substance, which we'll talk about today, or it could be a mixture, which we'll talk about tomorrow. So today we'll focus on substances, but I want you to think of matter. Okay, here's one example, or here's one part of matter. So we're going to focus on a substance. And so a substance is matter that has uniform and unchanging composition, meaning like when you look at it, you can't tell, it just looks like one thing. Like, so you can't identify different parts of the substance. It just looks like one continuous composition. So examples, like if you look at oxygen or what other things? Even like a metal like aluminum or water. Like all these things are examples of a substance. Non-examples, or what we might call materials, or not materials, but mixtures. Because remember, that's the other. So, like seawater. Seawater has salt and water in it. Even though you might not be able to see it, if you took a magnifying glass to it, you might be able to see the seawater. What other things? We can say even something like air is a mixture, because air is made up of different gases. So you have carbon dioxide and oxygen. So it's not a uniform composition, because it has different types. You have nitrogen gas. These are examples of a mixture. Seawater. There's a lot of different examples. Like when we had the beans, different beans. You can see how there's different types. All right, so let's stay with substances, okay? All right, so we're going to talk about first physical properties and then later chemical properties of matter. Now, physical properties are descriptors, so they're adjectives of matter. Okay, so descriptors. When we talk about physical changes and chemical changes, you're actually talking about like a verb, right? Or an actual action. So physical properties are characteristics that can be observed or measured without changing the sample's composition. So we can observe, like, for example, color. We can observe like the boiling point, melting point. So there's a lot of different things you can observe. You can observe the density. The mass, etc. And so when we think of physical properties, we think of it there's two categories. One is an extensive and the other one is intensive. So think of it as two subcategories under physical properties. So extensive depends on the amount of the substance. So, like the mass or the volume, length, things you can measure, right? The amount. Intensive is like independent of the amount. So it doesn't matter. For example, like, if we had zinc, the color of zinc is still going to be like a shiny kind of gray, right? You can also think of density is always going to be intensive. There's a lot of different intensive property. So like boiling point, the different melting point, all that stuff, freezing point, all that stuff is examples of physical property. Now, see, when something freezes, right, or at a freezing point, like say for water, it's still chemically water, it's H2O, it's just in a different form, right? So, like a physical property could be like state of matter. And that's a big one. So state of matter would be intensive. Okay? All right. Chemical properties. Chemical properties are the ability of a substance to combine with or change. So this one's a tough one, but oftentimes you'll see the word like reacts, like if it can react with something. The term reacts means, or the ability reacts, that's your chemical property. So it says reacts with, or what else? The ability to combine. Those are the big ones. Usually you'll see reacts with or something along that line. Okay? So like when it rusts, it reacts, is able to react with certain amounts. Or certain, like oxygen, for example. So here we have solid, liquid, and gas. Most of you know that. The biggest things here is, remember, states of matter is a physical property, right? So so a solid has a definite shape and volume. It has the lowest kinetic energy. So we think of solids as like they're rigid, they're very, and so these are solid molecules. They have a definite shape and they have a definite volume, and so they don't move very much because they're kind of stuck tightly. Liquid has a indefinite shape but has a volume. For example, if you put it in like a jar, you can measure the volume. And so we think of liquid as a little disorganized, and they're just kind of sliding past each other. So these liquid molecules are sliding past each other, whereas these are just vibrating. Gas, they're no longer attached, and so they are connected to each other, so they don't really have any volume or any shape. So here we go, physical versus chemical change, and actually I'm going to change this. There's actually 5 signs of chemical change. So a physical change is anything that you can alter a substance without changing its composition. So for example, anytime like any of the phase changes are big ones. So like melting, boiling. If you think about like melting ice or boiling water, it's still water, right? And so that's why. Now, these changes mean there's like a verb, right? So I want you to remember, like, there are chemical changes and there's chemical properties. So properties are kind of like an adjective, right? So they describe, versus a change, which is like a noun, right? So there's a big difference between the two. Here, the phase is changing, so you have melting, boiling. Notice the ing verbs. Like even if you cut them apart or separate somehow, those are example of physical changes, right? Chemical changes is when you form a new substance. And oftentimes we can't tell if we form a new substance, but here are 5 signs that it's a chemical change. First, you get color. You might get a color change. You could get a, we call this a temperature change, so it might get hotter or cooler. 3, you might get an odor change. You might get a precipitate. So a new solid is formed here. So precipitate means a new solid is formed. And there is a 5th here. Sorry, my thing went, but the 5th is a formation of a gas. So you got like bubbling or something like that. Okay. All right. And then lastly is what's called the conservation of mass. So mass can either be created or destroyed. Oops, that's wrong there. So not stored, but destroyed in a chemical reaction. So the mass of the reactants will always equal the mass of the products. Like, so you can't have more mass, you can't have less mass. Whatever mass you start with, since it can't be created or destroyed, you can't have more or less in terms of the products. And then here you have homework, and you'll have a quick check tomorrow. There's a key posted as well.